DreadOut is an indie horror game developed by the Indonesian developer Digital Happiness. The game was to be a love letter to many of the classic J-horror games that inspired the developers, such as Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Siren, but they wanted to differentiate it from those titles by blending it with the more combat-oriented gameplay of first-person shooter games of the time. Theoretically, it could be the best of both genres. Those fond of the gameplay of FPS games but were bored of muscular male protagonists, the words used by DreadOut's producer Rachmad Imran, not mine, I swear, would enjoy the game's combat, while the J-horror fans would find comfort in the shoes of another young female protagonist as she fights against overwhelming supernatural forces. At the time of its development, there were no AAA developers in Indonesia, and companies that did exist mostly catered to the mobile gaming market. In an economy that had little interest in video games, especially of the horror genre, it was difficult to secure funding without outside creative interference, and after struggling to stay within development budget, Digital Happiness turned to crowdfunding. Their Indiegogo campaign raised over $29,000, $4,000 above their initial goal. With this, they avoided the input of investors who wanted to push the game away from horror to something more marketable. DH stayed true to their vision for the game, which I find admirable. The game's setting was intended to evoke different aspects of Indonesia's diverse culture. The country consists of roughly 13,000 islands, each of which has its own unique environment. DH wanted to offer a slice of their country's culture since they are settings rarely seen in gaming. This also follows through to the game's story, which is based on urban legends, myths, and Indonesian history. When creating the game's enemies, they followed two core concepts that would easily categorize each one. They would either be classified as supernatural beings or physical beings. This, now that I think about it, is quite different to many other games in the genre, which mostly just use one of the two. Fatal Frame exclusively uses supernatural beings, while Resident Evil and Silent Hill use physical beings. The combination of the two gives the game a lot more freedom in how to approach different encounters, and it's clear the developers were aware of this because they included over 20 different types of enemies, all with their own unique and horrifying designs, as well as rich lore associated with them from their respective cultures. When it comes to actually fighting back against these myriad monstrosities, DreadOut puts a new twist on an old beloved formula. Out of all, DreadOut is most frequently compared to Fatal Frame, however it was never intended as a closely inspired homage. Much like how Fatal Frame contrasts the typical use of guns to combat foes in its contemporaries, DreadOut gives its protagonist cameras to defeat its enemies. Along with the fact that regular guns probably wouldn't be very effective against spectral beings, it's illegal to own guns in Indonesia, so it wouldn't make sense to use them here. DH also considered the use of religious items to defeat enemies as that's a common belief, but decided against it, probably to avoid any backlash from religious communities. Eventually, they settled on the camera concept because within several religions in Indonesia, there already exists the belief that photographs can steal a person's soul.
The belief that a photograph or graven image can steal a person's soul, or at least part of it, is one that permeates many cultures and religions across the globe. From some remote Native American and African tribes to more developed societies in Europe and Asia. Each community has its own variations on the belief, but the core concept remains. European folklore in particular focuses more on the use of mirrors to perform various supernatural acts, including predicting the future and capturing souls. This is especially relevant because non-digital cameras use tiny mirrors to capture the images. Although the modern world has generally become more distant to its spiritual and folkloric ancestry, the belief still remains in a vestigial capacity. It might not be as prominent as it once was, but there are still those doing research into the topic. For those unafraid of any negative consequences of interacting with human souls, either living or departed, they may engage with the practice of spirit photography. Spirit photography began to grow in popularity in the early 1900s with the occult boom in the West. During this time, people became enamored with the thought that the ghosts of their dead loved ones might be caught on film. And although there were numerous fraudsters who conned hopeful believers via some old-timey Photoshop techniques, the curiosity of many was captured, leading to further decades of attempts to prove the existence of the spirit realm via photography. It's fitting then that when peering through the camera lens in DreadOut, many of the supernatural beings you encounter will be made visible or will have their true visages revealed.
This is why I like DH's decision to use a camera as the sole weapon to combat the paranormal beings. It connects the game's modern characters to their ancient, traditional and spiritual past, which is actually something they specifically stated wasn't their intention when asked about the use of a smartphone compared to Fatal Frame's use of an older model of camera, but I consider it to be a happy accident. DreadOut was partly released in 2014, with Act 2 of the game following soon after. It received mixed reviews, being criticised for unpolished gameplay among various frustrating design choices. Digital Happiness were very open to criticism though, and worked with the community to resolve bugs and mechanical oversights, as well as improving localization. Their cooperation with their community very much helped shape the game into what it is today, which is uncommon for developers, most of which disregard negative criticism. One thing that was heavily criticised was the cross-dressing Scissor Phantom, a boss within the game. Many found it offensive, but DreadOut's producer assured them they meant no offence and simply wanted to represent an aspect of their culture that is generally accepted. When asked why the game initially released in a state that garnered such a mixed reaction, Imran explained that it was due to them having to split the game in two, which was a difficult decision for them to make. Said decision came after having issues with the game's engine and financial troubles. They took a risk releasing it in two parts, as the negative reviews they received could have ruined their chances of securing further funding and finishing the game. It seems they made the right call though, because if they had attempted to release the game as a whole, they might have had to eventually cancel it anyway due to lack of funding. Their dedication to releasing a quality horror experience carried them to a successful release, and the game currently stands with mostly positive reviews on Steam. The game has also received a DLC, a sequel, and even a film adaptation, the first two of which I plan on covering on the channel in the future. Prior to playing the game for this video, I'd attempted a playthrough of DreadOut many years ago, but bounced off it pretty hard. I found the gameplay frustrating and didn't enjoy what I felt were cheap jump scares that it provided within its first 30-ish minutes. One of the reasons I decided to take another stab at it was because I remembered the frequent hounding I received from an online friend, telling me to play DreadOut at almost every opportunity. I waved it off with a laugh each time, saying there was no way I'd put myself through what I'd assumed was going to be a miserable experience. In September, after noticing he'd been quiet on social media for a while, I discovered that that friend had passed away, and it was pretty hard news to take. Very few of you would probably know him, some who did might not even know he passed, but he was always such a positive and encouraging figure to have in our little community. The thought of dedicating a video to a lost friend feels weird to me, but I felt like I should mention it, because DreadOut, no matter what my opinion is by the end of it, will be special to me as a funny little pillar of our relationship. But anyway, it's time to dig into the story and see what DreadOut has in store for us. DreadOut begins with the vibrations of a ringing phone waking up the protagonist, Linda. She jolts awake in a creaking armchair and finds herself in an unfamiliar environment. The room is decrepit, neglected, and definitely is not a place a schoolgirl should find herself waking in. She retrieves her phone and sees her friend Ira is trying to call her. The call is frantic, almost as if Ira is trying to get as much information through as she can before she runs out of time. Either that, or a much more sinister possibility that something is using Ira or her voice to clumsily contact Linda, its next prey. The call ends abruptly with a sinister glitchiness, and as the phone returns to its camera function, it reveals an otherwise unseen ghost with a violently shaking, gaunt face. This is where you gain control and exit the shack to find Ira standing down the street. She disappears down a nearby alley, and as you follow after her, you'll find yourself hunted by the ghost you encountered in the hut. It can only be seen through your phone's camera, but its death rattle can always be heard as it slowly approaches you. You're not defenseless though, as the camera can be used to exorcise spirits. After snapping a quick photo of her, she evaporates into orange orbs, but it doesn't feel like she's been defeated entirely just yet. Inside a larger building, you catch another glimpse of Ira, except it's definitely not Ira, who is leading Linda deeper into this abandoned building. You find her Blair witching upstairs, and as soon as you raise your camera, the weak disguise is dropped, revealing the female ghost from earlier. You do battle with her in this cramped room, and die? I guess. This death is unavoidable, but it isn't the end. When you die in this game, you awaken in a state of limbo and are given a chance at resurrection so long as you reach the light in the distance. I believe this light source gets further away with each consecutive death within a short period of time, such as during a boss fight, which is an interesting approach to a respawn system. It forces the player to push forward if they want an attempt to progress. Failure is never the end so long as you don't give up. This mini, somewhat meta challenge for the player each time they die is reinforced when the distance becomes increasingly longer, meaning they themselves, and by extension the character they control, need a stronger will to overcome the challenge they face. You reawaken in the confined room and find the spirit gone. A deranged laughter can be heard in the distance, but downstairs is Ira, kneeling on the floor and crying into her hands. She pleads for you to help in between relapses of demonic laughter. You continue outside where the landscape opens up into a vast graveyard which stretches beyond the darkness. A colossal disfigured entity hangs on the opposite side, with 3 candles at its feet. Well, if it had feet. Hobbling monsters wrapped in bloody cloth emerge from between the gravestones, wielding rusty sickles. You can dispatch these like the other ghosts, and after doing so, all 3 candles will be lit. Photographing these candles will awaken the giant from its slumber, and it'll drop to the ground in front of you. It reaches out and the screen cuts to black. Well, that's what's supposed to happen, but this is what I saw. I'm not so sure that was intended. In the darkness, a woman in red appears, singing what seems to be a sad folk song. As she fades away, her voice distorts, and a closer image of her appears in the mind of Linda as she awakens from the nightmare we just experienced in a minivan with her classmates. A surprisingly cheery song replaces the previous one, and the tone resets to one a lot less dark and ominous. We join a group of teens and their teacher as they make their way to a school trip destination. They soon discover that the bridge ahead has been completely wiped out, and everyone gets out to inspect the area for alternate routes. Here we get a little introduction to each of the characters. Not much, but enough to get a general sense of their personalities. Most of them are insufferable, except for Ira, who shares a genuine connection with Linda, and you can tell they're good, long-time friends. One thing you might notice, especially if you're playing while wearing headphones, is that the voice actor for the teacher has a very moist mouth. It sounds like she's recording her lines between bites of a creamy pasta dish, and I wouldn't be surprised if any players found it very off-putting. I don't know if this was an intended horror element within the game, but each slimy lip smack sent shivers down my spine. Also, Shelley might need to see a chiropractor because her posture is fucked. Fun fact, you can actually run back up the road the group just travelled, and if your curiosity does in fact get the better of you, you'll find yourself running for what could possibly be an eternity. Eventually, one of Linda's classmates will find a path through some trees that, no offense, I found earlier and it wouldn't let me through, but whatever, he can have the glory, I guess. What follows is a long run across the honestly boring landscape to an abandoned, uncharted town. The only remaining inhabitants of the town are the flies that swarm piles of rubbish that line the streets and an invisible group of birds in the square. Some interesting notes can be found in the empty buildings that hint at the town's troubled past, troubles that, no doubt, directly resulted in its current state. At the top of the hill is a school, and some of the group decide to explore it, while Linda and Ira sit and fucking hell, Ira, chill. The next thing we know, it's dark, and wait, have they been sitting and chatting here all this time? I mean, I'd have to assume they didn't leave on their school trip late in the evening, so the two must have been sitting here for at least 4 or 5 hours for it to get this dark. Anyway, as you enter the building to look for the others, we see them exit, all except for Yayan. Everyone goes back inside to search, and Ira begins to act strangely. She is possessed by something that traps the group inside the school before collapsing. Linda finds herself in the crumbling foyer, alone with only her camera as company. You're now given a large area of the school to explore. Many of the classrooms and offices are open to you, and it doesn't take long for the paranormal presences that inhabit them to make themselves known. One such entity is a colossal pig that, when observed through the phone's camera, reveals a grotesque humanish face. It charges at you, but after a few unphotogenic snaps, it'll retreat to its lair to recover its health. This pig is not so much an enemy as it is a puzzle that took me so long to figure out that I began to have White Day flashbacks. The way to solve it is to unlock a gate upstairs, which you're led to by a cat, for some reason, and photograph red markings that paint a picture across the foyer's walls and pillars. The markings are only visible through the camera, which I like. Similar to some puzzles in Fatal Frame, the photograph will reveal a different location. This one depicts several students bound and hanged in a downstairs classroom. It's also very difficult to notice, but you may spot a key in the desk at the very bottom of the image. If you were like me though, you may not, and will, after much frustration, resort to internet forums for a clue on how to progress. With your amazing observation skills, you return to the pictured room to retrieve the key you obviously found because you're so great, and can then use it to unlock a closet upstairs. The closet hides a secret nursery filled with strange ornaments. A baby's cot sits in the corner, and upon inspecting it, Linda will be attacked by a malevolent scissor-wielding phantom. This is the first boss fight of the game, and boy does it suck. Simply put, the fight boils down to trying to run around the room, avoiding the phantom's slashes, while trying to snap a picture here and there to deplete its health. It sounds easy enough, but a lot of the time you can't damage the phantom because your camera won't glitch like it always does to imply the enemy can be damaged. It's almost like either the ghost or the camera is on an invisible timer, but there's no indication of either, bar the obvious lack of glitching. The thing is, there's no time to run away if you realize your phone isn't glitching, because by that point it's already too late and the phantom can get an easy hit on you. Another thing I found irritating was that the snipping sound of the scissors that you use to locate the phantom actually gets drowned out by the high-pitched music that starts playing in the background. This was an incredibly frustrating fight and took me more than 5 attempts to beat. I often compliment boss fights in other games that require you to keep moving instead of just spamming attacks from a stationary position, but while this boss fight does indeed do that, I can't find any positives in how it was executed. It seems unfair and unbalanced, and I'm still surprised that I got through it in less than 10 attempts. So, upon defeating the phantom, you'll receive its pair of scissors, which you can then use to cut loose a set of school keys hanging around the pig's neck. For some reason it fell asleep here instead of its usual hiding place, which is convenient. Now you can leave the school, but the foyer is blocked by a swarm of flies. Passing through it will result in you being chased through an infinite hall by a giant woman until she kills you. It's actually pretty goddamn scary, and I distinctly recall the hair on the back of my neck standing up as the chaotic sound of her wailing and stomping got closer and closer. After you wake up, you can traverse the infinite hall without being pursued, but you'll soon notice that all the doors are locked. A glance through your camera, however, will reveal a hidden exit. This leads you back to the foyer, and as you attempt to leave, you're ambushed by the woman in the red dress that Linda had visions of at the very start of the game. She'll attack you with insects that will actually invert your controls, making it disorienting and difficult to further evade her grasp. She'll eventually stop attacking though, and will allow you to leave. The developers made an odd decision here to include a piece of rock music, as if it were some badass biker gang game. It doesn't fit at all, but to be honest, none of the music does in this game, so I'll move on. Now that you've escaped the haunted school, you're safe, right? Wrong. Now you're in the town's haunted outskirts. Before long, you're ambushed by tiny little creatures known as Tuyul, who surround Linda and steal her belongings. Now you have to go retrieve them without any form of protection from the violent spirits that infest the town. Well, that would be the case if not for the fact that the only foe you encounter until you do is your classmate Donnie, who has been possessed and tries to kill you. The chase that ensues offers a nice switch up in gameplay as you have to make your way through a gauntlet of overgrown streets and rotten buildings. There's even a little stealth section where you have to avoid his line of sight. Well, it's pretty rudimentary, but I can see what they were going for. The one issue I do have with this segment is that Donnie's charges can be incredibly difficult to deal with because he'll sprint in from off screen to tackle you. There's nowhere near enough time for you to dodge unless you're really taking your time, but then it's going to take even longer to escape him, so I'm not sure it's worth it. Eventually you'll be cornered by Donnie, and the spirit inhabiting his body will erupt out and choke you before snapping the neck of its host, killing him. Linda limps away through the train, distraught, and collapses to join the mummified corpses of the crash victims that are strewn across its interior. She wakes up to one of their hands grabbing her and finds an SLR camera in perfect condition, which is very unlikely, but we'll roll with it. The SLR is sort of an upgrade to the phone's camera, although when using it you don't have a flashlight to illuminate your way. Instead, the SLR has a flash function which briefly lights up the area in front of you before quickly fading back to total darkness. This is a really cool feature, and I honestly wish the game utilised it more, being something akin to the gameplay of Madison, which revolves entirely around that concept, and it works amazingly. DreadOut does nothing with it though, which is a serious missed opportunity. You don't even get a moment where you have to traverse a spooky house with nothing to light your way except for the fleeting flashes that give form to your surroundings but may also reveal the spectral residents within them, creating a feeling of tension and apprehension behind every press of the button. There's no opportunity for this because within 30 seconds of finding the SLR, you use it to retrieve your belongings, phone included. So anyway, through the end of the train is a pathway up to a very strange place. As you approach it, you're greeted by 2 women, with another 2 sitting in the middle of a pond, bathing their feet, or something. At the far side of the pond is a group playing music and dancing, although the audio for both instruments actually only comes from one of the women. Behind them, suspended in the air, is a colossal woman. She very much gives the impression of a mythical deity that can bless you with good fortune if you appease her. In fact, this entire area feels like a holy place, except there's just something that doesn't feel right about it. The tranquil atmosphere, the beautiful maidens, the serene music that echoes through the lush greenery, it all feels like a thinly veiled disguise of something much more sinister. There are a few puzzles to solve here that require you to position yourself in a way that lines up specific monuments. Each one will light a candle below the giant woman. I did get stuck on one of them because I couldn't find a way to get past a wall of ferns blocking the entrance. It very much seems like this is the area's boundary because there's nothing to indicate otherwise. However, it turns out you're supposed to take a photo of the plants and they'll disappear. I'm not sure how anyone's supposed to figure that one out. After solving the last of the puzzles here, the once calming pondscape will be plunged into darkness and the soothing music will be replaced by eerie voices sounding out from the shadows. Where the giant woman once floated is now a path through a graveyard. I chose to make the moment spookier by lighting my way with the SLR's flashes, even though I didn't need to at all. At the end you find the woman, who removes her disguise to reveal her true form, the giant malformed figure we saw at the start of the game. It falls to the ground and begins to attack from its prone position. After taking some damage, it will retreat to the walls above and summon zombie pawns that can easily stunlock you if you're not careful. Eventually, it will grab you and hold you up in front of its hideous face. This gives you a chance to snap a photo of it, but for some reason that's exactly not what you're supposed to do. I found myself caught in an unending loop of being grabbed, trying to snap a photo to defend myself and then getting killed. I genuinely had no idea what I was doing wrong and only got past this because I began frustratingly scribbling notes and left the game to play, and assumedly repeat, in the background. Look, here's a photo that shows the exact moment this happened. For whatever reason, if you don't attack this creature, it will just die on its own. The lady in red will then descend into the pit and you'll be forced to do battle with her too. This is another situation where you're actually just supposed to do nothing, as the only way to progress is to be killed by her. Like, fuck me for trying to fight back for a whole 5 minutes, I guess. So yeah, after dying and running over to the light again, you resurrect to find yourself in a different part of the town. This area has more houses, some of which are inhabited by a female ghost whose cries you'll hear long before you see her. Inside what I think is a hospital, you'll find Shelley wrapped up in a blanket for safety. As she questions Linda about the others' whereabouts, Miss Siska stumbles in, looking quite dishevelled. The 2 girls nurse her back to health as much as possible, and she explains that her injuries are the result of Ira's attacks. We leave to go find Ira and follow her to a nearby building. Linda takes the seat in front of her and Ira starts rushing through what feels like a rehearsed impression of how the 2 usually interact. You don't need to notice her white eyes to know that she's definitely not okay. The sheer speed at which she talks is enough of an indication that she's not acting naturally right now. The facade quickly drops after you call her out though, and the spirit that inhabits her, that also possessed Donnie earlier, emerges and kills her in the same way. You return to the 2 in the hospital and find their corpses strung up from the ceiling. Linda, weirdly, reacts to this more than she does after witnessing the death of her best friend. Regardless, you press onwards to a mansion at the top of the village, the key to which you found after Ira died. You enter a long hall with a large mirror at the end. The sound of heavy breathing follows you with each step until you realize, by looking in the mirror, that the spirit that possessed Linda's friends is also clinging to her back. To shake her off, you need to take a photo of her in several mirrors due to them breaking each time. Upstairs is a door that when you try to open, you'll be knocked down to the hall below. It appears there was possibly a wedding reception here before everything went to shit, and the spirit, who is currently invisible, will begin thrashing the furniture and music equipment about in a temper as you try to find opportunities to somehow photograph it. It's a really spooky little sequence, and I found it incredibly enjoyable. Having to track the ghost by its breathing and objects shifting was quite fun, and it was yet another instance of this game mixing up the gameplay to provide a fresh experience. The cherry on top of the cake that is this section is a boss fight against the invisible ghost inside a room with a mirrored wall. You can only see her in the mirror and will need to judge where she is in the room so that you can photograph her directly. It's actually challenging enough and made for a really solid boss fight, by far and unfortunately the best in the game, although that's honestly not very high praise as many of them require you to literally do nothing. Once the mirror ghost is defeated, you'll continue exploring and will find a bedroom decorated with red wallpaper, red upholstery and paintings of women in red dresses. I'm sensing a theme here. Linda sits at a small mirror in the corner, and the lady in red soon appears behind her. She whispers something, and Linda's reflection pulls us seemingly through the mirror to join them. Linda awakens outside the old school again, and as soon as you pass through its entrance, you're thrust into a boss fight against the Red Woman. This is without a doubt the most frustrating boss fight in the game, and the shift in quality between this and the one we had just a few minutes ago is enough to give you whiplash. It begins with you battling the Red Lady, but if she catches you, which she almost definitely will, you'll be submerged in darkness and will have to defeat a spirit that vomits maggots. This part of the fight isn't actually that bad. In fact, I enjoyed how the spirit was only visible under the flash of my camera. It made for some truly terrifying moments. After defeating this spirit, you'll return to the foyer with the lady in red and have to find a way to escape her since your camera does absolutely no damage to her. The way to do this is to take a photo of the maggot vomiting spirit, which is sitting above the exit door. It flickers into visibility occasionally, so actually getting a photo of it is quite difficult. What makes this escape so damn frustrating is that the Red Woman never stops moving towards you, and there's barely enough room in this arena to get more than one shot at the door spirit before you get killed, even if you lead the woman over to the opposite side of the room before doing so. It honestly took me a while to figure out that I was supposed to even photograph the door ghost, so all my previous attempts at trying to find a method of hurting the Red Woman were in vain. I resorted to searching the internet for an answer, but even after trying to photograph the door ghost like I'd seen other people do, it was still very difficult to get a photo that actually registered as valid. Look, you may think I get nitpicky when it comes to some things, but I swear this is not a nitpick. You can see here that I took a photo of the ghost fully manifested, but for some reason it didn't count. It legitimately took me 40 minutes to beat this boss alone. 40 fucking minutes. Eventually I managed to defeat the door ghost after spamming photos, and upon doing so it erupts with maggots and bile. The lady in red is now alone and can be hurt by your camera just like every other spirit. Doing enough damage to her will open up the door, allowing you to pass through into a maze that's only visible through the camera's lens. She slowly stalks you as you try to find your way to the end, with her playful laughs echoing through the formless halls. You eventually find the skeleton of a colossal snake that the Red Lady was protecting. Photographing it will transport you both to the Limbo realm, where the light in the distance is replaced by a monstrous being in chains. Your attacks send chains to confine the woman. She taunts Linda into unleashing her power, and in doing so Linda frees the woman from her chains. While walking into the gaping maw of the chained entity, she hints that this is only the beginning for Linda. I already knew this though, as I had bought the other two games prior to playing this one. Linda awakens on the foyer floor and sees Miss Siska, who apparently is still alive, leave with a snake-tailed baby in her arms. The game ends with another rock song that doesn't really fit, although it's not as ill-fitting as the rest. The song plays out through the credits, after which we get a glimpse of the events following the game's end. We see Linda walk through a snowy street past strangers who all have shadowy figures emerging from them. She stops and takes off her headphones, revealing a cacophony of snarls, moans and death rattles from the assumedly possessed people surrounding her. Her eyes glow red for a second before the screen fades to black again. A pretty intriguing teaser of what may be the next game's events. It definitely got me a little hyped to play it, whenever that may be. I feel like DreadOut's story was extremely lacking, or at least the presentation of it was anyway. After beating the game, I couldn't tell why anything that happened, but after doing some research, I discovered that it seems Miss Siska was the mastermind behind everything, which is genuinely quite a shock. She brought the group to the village intending to use the children to distract the three sisters who guard the imprisoned Ouroboros, which is a snake-like deity, a depiction of which can be seen in the game's logo. At the end we see her leave with a weird snake baby, so it's probable that was it, whatever it is. The three sisters I mentioned are the women in red. Yeah, it was actually different people entirely, not just the same woman sporting different hairstyles like I thought. The sisters were the good guys, which was a cool twist, and by the end of the game their duty of imprisoning the Ouroboros was passed on to Linda, who displays blossoming spiritual abilities. I can only assume that the following games follow her tracking down Miss Siska and trying to capture the Ouroboros before things get too out of hand. While I feel like this game could have done better at telling its story, hell, even some of the dialogue wasn't subtitled so non-Indonesian speakers wouldn't know what was being said, I also think it was made intentionally vague for this first entry. I mean, even the wiki isn't entirely sure what's going on. This storytelling method can of course work well in games. Just look at how beloved the stories of the Dark Souls games are, despite how much effort is needed to extract every detail and connection within. However, I can't help being disappointed with how DreadOut handled it. In such a short game, you'd expect a tight story with thrills and blood spills to guide you along, but this felt like not much more than a generic low-budget horror film made for horny youths to fondle each other to. The game's folklore, on the other hand, is something I really enjoyed. You're exposed to many different types of spirits and creatures throughout the game, and with each one comes a feeling of wonder and a yearning to uncover more about what you've just encountered. The Ghostpedia serves as a supernatural bestiary, which catalogues each entity upon encountering them. I especially like its inclusion as it allowed me to learn about these folkloric monstrosities beyond just their appearance. This is something I did with each new encounter, as I often found them captivating. I mean, just look at this goddamn abomination called a Palasic that just swoops at me through the trees. Do you want nightmares? Go read up on this thing. As I'm not very familiar with Indonesian culture and folklore, I really appreciate this window into what is clearly a rich history of spiritual beliefs within the country. It really felt like the devs wanted to stuff this game with as many different ghosts as possible, and I honestly applaud them for it. The general gameplay feels fine, although there's a consistent level of jank that you'll have to just adapt to while playing. I wouldn't say it makes this game that much worse as an experience, it's just par for the course with indie games of the time really. The combat can be difficult to get a grip on, which I feel is due to a lack of playtesting against each enemy type. The Scissor Phantom boss was especially tough due to its speed being above what seemed mechanically reasonable to fight against in this game. It's like putting 9-ball from Armored Core in the first Resident Evil game. I also found it interesting that the camera has no limit to the amount of photos it can take, unlike other horror games that limit the amount of ammo available to dispatch foes with. The lack of a limit means there's less of a challenge when engaging with enemies, but to be honest, it seems appropriate, as much as I don't care for it. DreadOut very much feels like a horror film with how it plays. There's no real challenge to the gameplay, as there's no ammo limit, no healing items, and no punishment for dying. This is not dissimilar to how films operate, in which a gun's clip capacity rarely matters. The main character can nearly always carry on regardless of serious untreated injuries, and they don't die. As a game, I would have liked DreadOut to be a bit more challenging, but it doesn't seem like that was Digital Happiness's goal, so I'm okay with how it turned out. The limbo mechanic both works and doesn't work depending on your experience with the game. If you're enjoying the game, you'll have no issue pushing towards the light each time because you want to progress, but if you're not enjoying it, the constantly increasing time it takes to even be able to respawn will probably become the reason you quit the game. It's different to a loading screen as well, because where you can sit back and relax between death and respawn in other games, here you need to hold a button to run towards it. On paper it seems like a cool idea, but having to spend a minute and a half running in the same direction just to respawn gets annoying really quickly. It almost feels like a punishment when you're spending more time doing this than the time you get to spend trying to fight the boss. It also doesn't help when the backer submitted messages that appear during your journey of self-revival either break immersion completely or just feel condescending. Like, look at this one. I've only been playing for a while because your puzzles suck ass and I keep dying while trying to solve them, DreadOut. Digital Happiness received much negative feedback regarding these messages, so they included an option to turn them off. I wish I knew that before finishing the game. The visuals perform their duty to perfection. The environments are well realised and build an authentic feeling atmosphere. You can nearly smell the musty school halls as you walk through them, and the abundance of rubbish and dirt that infests the town creates a feeling that this remote community was gradually rotting away long before it finally collapsed. The same praise cannot be given to the audio though. DreadOut has a lot of audio issues that seem to crop up in almost every area of the game. Character dialogue quality can be really mismatched, Ambient audio sources will be placed within the environment where you can circle around them, which can destroy immersion. The sound of rustling bushes will play in a slightly different location as you run through them, which makes it sound like there's someone following behind you. Dialogue is often very poorly timed and characters will talk over each other. There's even an instance where a woman washes her feet in a pond, but the audio that plays was clearly recorded inside a room. I have more examples, but I don't want to bore you. Suffice to say that although the audio that's used is usually good, it's implemented terribly, which can really kill the mood when you're doing something like chatting to your possessed best friend and the audio clip of a ghost keeps repeating in the street outside. When developing the game, Digital Happiness chose to focus on subtle puzzles, which is ironic because most of the puzzles in this game can be put into one of two categories. Ones that utilize the camera in really interesting ways and present a reasonable challenge to the player whilst remaining grounded in the game's reality, and ones that pissed me off so much that I frantically scribbled angry notes in all caps after either completing them or reading how to complete them in an online walkthrough. The boss fights are the biggest offenders here, often requiring you to do something that is either so nearly impossible that you think it can't be the correct solution, or requiring you to do something so ridiculous that you question if there's even a correct solution. I died so many times to most of the bosses in this game because the necessary information just was not communicated to me, the player. I mean, for Christ's sake, I still wake up in a sweat after having nightmares of being stuck in that infinite loop trying to defeat that giant boss. It takes a serious case of sadism to make the only method of defeating a boss to not use literally the only weapon at your disposal that you've been using thus far to defeat enemies without any indication that you need to do so. With that said, the few times when the game's puzzles and bosses were done well, they were extremely enjoyable. That mirror-oriented boss fight was one of the better ones I've experienced in a horror game. It was not only terrifying, but challenged me to use my brain and experience with the game's mechanics to overcome it. If more of the puzzles had utilised the game's main mechanic, being the cameras, then DreadOut might have become one of the best horror games I had played. And finally, the horror elements in DreadOut actually really impressed me. Maybe it's because I'm just off the back of White Day, a labyrinth named school, which was far from frightful, but I really enjoyed this game's haunting atmosphere, its creepy settings, and especially the often grotesque things I encountered within. There were plenty of moments that unnerved me. That hallway bit in particular comes to mind, and coming across a new type of ghost or ghoul you've never seen before scratched my horror-loving itch each time. At times it felt like I was on a roller coaster, and every which way I looked there was some new foul creature that was trying to fuck me up. It's a really fun game for horror and dark folklore fans alike. I feel somewhat conflicted after playing DreadOut. If I were to describe the experience with one word, it would be unstable. Yet it did leave a pretty positive impression on me. It has its flaws, which are numerous indeed, but there's a sense of heart I get while playing it that I haven't gotten from a lot of other games. I enjoyed DreadOut, but it's not easy to love. If you can look past its mostly mechanical shortcomings, then what you'll find is a game that's rich with a love of culture and the occult, which are personally two of my favourite things in horror media. If you'd like to experience it yourself and don't mind me having spoiled mostly everything, then I encourage you to play it. I'm excited to play the following games and I hope you watch my videos on them too. Before I go, I'd like to just mention that I tried a slightly different style of writing for this video. It might not have been obvious, but I put a lot more thought into inspecting if and how the developers successfully realized their creative intentions, and if not, why. It's one of the things I felt was lacking in my videos, and if not for extremely helpful chats with a few creators including Acer Aesthetics, Tango Mushi and The Gaming Muse, then I might not have worked out how to go about it exactly. So I'd like to thank them and encourage everyone to check out their channels. They're by far some of my favourite creators, and I'd easily spend my last breath recommending their videos. You'll find a link to their channels in the description, as well as in my favourite analysis channels section at the bottom of my channel homepage. I'd also like to thank PimScript for working with me on this video. As with everyone I collaborate with, I'm a big fan of their work and hope to help more people find them. So if you're interested in videos about nuanced topics within spooky media, I'd highly recommend checking out Pim's channel. There'll be a link in the description as well as on my channel page. Anyway, that's all from me. Thanks for watching.